Wait. Okay, we're live.
Okay, here we are. We're back. It's the 18th of March, 2017. This is Brian Lance here for this meeting of the Schiller Institute and LaRouche organization. And we've been working our way through LaRouche's elementary textbook, mathematical textbook on economics. So you wish to learn all about economics is the title. Originally published in 1984 and republished in the mid-2000s. I'm trying to look here just to confirm that what that reproduction date is, but that was roughly when it was reproduced. I've actually got the old copy, so it's not mentioned here, of course. I'm going to be drawing on chapter 4, but also you could really see 6 and 8 and so forth in developing some of the concepts. To start with, I want to just recapitulate some of the ideas that we've been presenting. Keisha Rogers, Ron Batag, and myself over the last, I guess it's been 5 weeks or so now. We've been talking about, we're talking about how mankind reproduces itself, specifically how a society, our society, of course, is what we're concerned about in particular, how it reproduces itself from generation to generation. And we've been discussing concepts in terms of forms of measuring that progress in terms of increases of potential relative population density, increasing energy flux density, utilized per capita or across the land area, essentially dividing the land area of the nation by the number of people or the productive workforce of that nation, how that increases, the energy flux density increases. We've talked about capital intensity as well as a feature of that, or encompassing that idea of energy flux density. Nowhere in any of this do you see discussion of money. And you'll find only in LaRouche's textbook, he calls it the textbook, there's one chapter, dispensing with monetary theory. I don't even know if we're going to deal with it in these immediate weeks, except by way of in passing. That is not what's fundamental. We're looking at the physical process by which man organizes the physical process of reproduction of society itself. To use to make a comparison here, now there's all this noise over GCHQ, over the General Communication Headquarters. That's the NSA equivalent in Britain, and its role in bugging Trump Tower, and its role in spying on Trump. And of course, it's already known that British intelligence authored and was responsible for promoting the sexed up dossiers that got us into the Iraq War via Tony Blair, and more recently the dossier on Trump that came out care of Christopher Steagall of MI6 of British intelligence and so forth. So all of this is now kind of coming out on the table, spilling out on the table, as I think more than one person has been comparing it, has compared it to the Wizard of Oz, and the wizard from behind the curtain saying to Dorothy, "Do not touch that curtain. Do not look behind that curtain.
Pay no attention.
Pay no attention to what's behind the curtain." People remember the lines better than I do. Well, what's my comparison? Well, monetarism. The whole idea that the economy can be understood and explained and left to the workings of the marketplace is as big a fraud as the wizard, as indicated in terms of the Wizard of Oz, in terms of denying the real science of economics. And I would just indicate, go back to Alexander Hamilton. We've discussed Hamilton, we've gone through his papers, and they're available now on the LaRouche PAC website, continuing to be available there for download for free. The reports to Congress. In these papers, you don't see Alexander Hamilton obsessing over money. His report is on the report on national credit. It's not on how do we get the British banks to find us to be a, you know, a slavish, willing victim of British usury and usurious practices. You don't see that. He's not worrying about that. He's worrying about manufacturers. He's discussing how do we build up the productive powers of our nation. And that is the heart and soul of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was not worrying about money. He was willing to print greenbacks right and left if that was useful to his purposes. He was interested in building the Transcontinental Railroad. He was interested in building up the nation as a productive capability, and you could develop the same in terms of the role of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in terms of World War II and Franklin Roosevelt's effort. So we're dealing here, but from a more advanced standpoint, a much more advanced standpoint. This process of expanded reproduction, the development, the growth of society. Now LaRouche starts in terms of action, of physical action. He starts with the concept of circular action, and we've discussed this over the last few weeks in different ways. But just to bring this back to it, he emphasizes that we're starting with circular action as a physical action. We're starting with that not because this is something we want to impose on nature, but this is something that nature imposes on us, on mankind. We find the process not only in terms of the cycles, in terms of the solar system and the rising and setting of the sun and so on and so forth. Not only in that form, but in terms of the forms of action, of repeated action and so forth. We're dealing with cyclical processes, whether we're talking about astronomy, we're talking about the seasons, we're talking about physical action in terms of the action that man undertakes to plow a field or dig a ditch or drive nails and so on and so forth. And if you, as he emphasizes, if you utilizing it for simple purposes, the idea of an XY axis, if you then add a Z axis to that, you're introducing time, you're introducing change over time, and you're introducing right there and then, you're introducing the idea of conic action, of spiral action, of development. I don't know if you we have some, if you can.
I can pull, if you want to look that up, Keisha.
Okay.
You could just go.
Here's the textbook. So you wish to know all about economics, that's available at Amazon.com. Otherwise, you can contact our offices here in Houston and elsewhere for copies. But if we go down a few more. Okay. Yeah. This is the kind of growth process that we're talking about. Here's one idea of spiral action. That's useful enough for this from the standpoint. Now, what is the implication of this? What is the implication, as we've discussed over the last several weeks, not just what I'm summarizing here, but what are the implications of the fact that we must grow, that societies must grow? That is, neg entropy, not entropy, but neg entropy is the natural and necessary condition of mankind and mankind in the universe. And as we've developed, at least briefly, this is also what we see in nature, not only in the case of a nautilus shell, but in terms of the development of what we know of the biosphere, for example, over eons, in terms of the development of increasingly complex plant life, animal life, involving increasing energy flux density of utilization. All of this indicates something about the universe in which we live in, as well as what otherwise is necessary for mankind's continued existence. Well, it raises the question of how do we actually determine value? We can talk about a growth process. We can talk about a sense of conic action in terms of a growing spiral on a cone as a kind of mathematical approach to a mathematics, of a geometrical construction of a mathematical model. But value, the question of value, becomes very important here. And this is where we take off in chapter 4. And there's a few copies of So You Wish to Know About Economics for people who want to follow along, or maybe you brought your own copies here. But I'll just start here, chapter 4. Mr. LaRouche starts out, our adopted mathematical function shows that a society, economy, becomes entropic unless there is technological progress to the effect of increasing the potential relative population density. Hence, for the society, the economy, as a whole, economic value is restricted to that quality of activities within a society which increases the potential relative population density through the mediation of technological progress. This is the first paragraph there. I'll repeat that last sentence.
Which chapter?
Chapter 4, starting on page 63. Hence, for the society, economy as a whole, economic value is restricted to that quality of activities within a society which increases the potential relative population density through the mediation of technological progress. In other words, economic value, properly defined, measures the negentropy of the economic process. Economic value so defined and work have the same meaning. So, value, the value of your activity, the value of my activity, is not something to be simply measured. It is not something to be quantized as, for example, with money. What is the money value of something? The value of activity, of human activity, of what each of us contributes, is specifically the extent to which that activity increases the potential relative population potential density of our society, and through that, mankind as a whole. That's the basis of value. If you think of society, we've discussed this, if we think about this from the standpoint of society today, of course we have a disaster. We have most people employed in activity which contributes in no way to the development of future generations. Think of the overhead in terms of services and the shrinking portion of the population that's engaged in physical changes on nature for man, to get a first approximation of that. Now, key to this, to increasing the value, the value produced by mankind, is the role of technology. The role of technology in specifically labor savings, the reduction of the expenditure of labor to produce physical changes on nature. On page 67, he says, if we desire to secure the optimal rate of advance of the economy of labor, we must define this not merely as a matter of investment policies, but a matter of what technologies are available for investment purposes. Let me just quote here briefly from a paper LaRouche wrote in December of 2006, the lost art of the capital budget. So this This is 2 decades after the writing of his of So You Wish to Know About Economics. And this is on the cusp of the financial blowout. This is December of 2006. The financial blowout, the so-called Great Recession, the actual economic blowout that is not over yet, began the following July of 2007. So that's roughly 7 months out from when this paper was written. And he starts here, The Lost Art of Capital Budget, just to step back and frame where we are in the world. He says, since the notorious uproar of 1968, the Vietnam War protests, the emergence of the rock, drug, sex counterculture, and so forth. Since the notorious uproar of 1968, which erupted in Europe as in the Americas, the mayfly passions of the upper 20 percentile of today's reigning white-collar baby boomer generation are frequently expressed as the loss of the desire for the practice of long-term marriages, a loss of caring for the prospects of younger generations, and a loss of any interest in investment in the future of the physical economy of other nations or even their own. Hence, since that generation dominates our Senate and also much of our House of Representatives, and of course that's only grown in the intervening years in that, our Congress had in the main lately misplaced the pivotal conception on which the future existence of our nation now depends, the concept of a capital budget. This must now be changed. What has been lost is a sense of the meaning of indispensable capital investment. Think of technology. Capital investment in the physical conditions of progress. He puts those in quotes. It means a loss of the meaning of the investment required not only to rescue the USA, but to secure the civilized future existence of the world as a whole. Some among you are perhaps angered by what I'm saying. Think carefully. Witness the ration of the members of the US Congress who counted every budgeted dollar of public expenditure as outlays, which must be balanced by current tax receipts. From the standpoint of any competent economist, that policy is, in effect, the practice of ruinous, sheer, inhuman recklessness in economic policy of practice. And he has more choice words to say about the baby boomers. Suffice it to summarize, I'm trying, let me see if I can find it here. We have now entered a state of affairs in which even among the most respectable Democrats in the Senate, recent legislation has driven the nation ever deeper into the non-productive direction, and thus towards the brink of a most calamitous national bankruptcy. Again, remember, this is on the verge of the 2007 through 2009 blowout. Meanwhile, the same legislators often delude themselves that the practice of goodness is offering palliatives of mercy to families which the Congress itself has actually ruined, as by its neglecting the defense of the conditions needed for recent employment and for protecting pensions at decent levels of family income, and so forth. So you get the sense of this, that we have not addressed ourselves to the question of determining what are those technologies. In fact, that's become a bad word, technologies, unless it's applied to post-industrial, airy-fairy technologies, as we associate with Silicon Valley or something, right? Or Hollywood, this great font of inventive ingenuity of some sort. But we've turned our back on this. So LaRouche in his economics is giving back to us a basis on a more advanced level of the framework, the foundation upon which a reorganization of the U.S. economy is going to be required today, in the coming months, under the existing hopefully under the existing Trump administration, in a bipartisan fashion across party lines. So these are extraordinarily important concepts to be wrestling with at this very moment. He goes on to say, this is on page 67 again of chapter 4 of So You Wish to Know All About Economics. On this account, a rigorous definition of economic value is required. Repeat. On this account, a rigorous definition of economic value is required to integrate the making of long-range decisions on investment in science with return on investment decisions in the production of physical goods. We require a measure of economic value applicable to science as well as to the productive process of the economy. This is the last paragraph on page 67. Now, think of the space program as an example of that. What has happened to it, but now the potential for reviving it is an example. Now, he identifies 3 areas. This is on page 71. He identifies 3 areas which are critical for defining a integrated approach to policy making in terms of science as well as investment decisions. And let me just reference this so it takes it out of the abstract. I've just recently been reading a book by the gentleman that was put in charge of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Jesse Jones, yeah. Put in charge by Franklin Roosevelt. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation had actually been already created under Hoover, but it was completely retooled, so to speak, by FDR and with Jesse Jones being really the manager on the scene of this effort. At the time, in 1940, well, go back further. Starting in 1933, 34, 35, but on up, including up through 1940, American companies were not interested. They were scared to invest in the kinds of processes that would be required to build the United States up for a war effort. They did not want to go there. It was understood through the work of MacArthur's circles and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur's team and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and otherwise, what a war mobilization effort would require. But if you talked about U.S. Steel, if you talked about major companies, this is not to cast aspersions on any one of these companies per se or their leadership, but the idea of expending tremendous amounts of money to build entirely new plants or to reconfigure existing plants, to buy machine tools, additional machinery, and so forth. This was a major undertaking, and they could imagine that within a couple of years, if there was a war, hopefully there wouldn't be a war, but if there was a war, within a couple of years, there wouldn't be a need for this capability anymore, and they'd be stuck with the bill, so to speak, right? They'd be on the losing end. So
the military would be stuck with the bill, or
no, the companies.
Oh, the
Companies, yeah.
Okay.
So if you go back and read some of the history, even a kind of gloss of the history of this period and what was actually undertaken, the U.S. government, our government, we expended hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars building plants across the United States. We created, oversight councils. We contracted for the building of steel mills, aluminum mills, machine tool capabilities, on and on and on.
Recycle resources.
Recycled. Well, actually, I mean, we were having to produce. We shipped a lot of our stuff in terms of salvage, to Japan, for example, in terms of steel and so forth, right? Which they turned into, battleships and so on and so forth. In fact, we didn't have a lot of old stuff to draw upon. we had to create new capacity, not simply recycle existing equipment. But yes, that's definitely a component as well. So so then what these companies, who ran these companies? Well, the United States government, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and the other entities created, then contracted with companies like U.S. Steel, Alcoa Aluminum, which was really at the start the only aluminum company in the United States, to run these factories. They would lease them for $1 a year, or some other agreement, or $5 per ton of something would go back to the government for every ton produced out of the plant and sold, right? In the contracts themselves, the contracts, we're speaking of what was undertaken during World War II by the U.S. government, because companies were afraid. So we've got a few new people coming in, so I'm just kind of catching up here, catching them up. This effort involved as well features in these contracts, which include the fact that the U.S. government committed itself, we committed ourselves to buy back the equipment after the war was over at a depreciated rate, an agreed depreciation rate, for the wear and tear of the equipment and so on and so forth. So when we were buying back brand new what had been used up, and to return the factory floors back to the original condition they existed in before the mobilization effort started. These were features of the contracts. These were the major contracts. As opposed to World War I, where 95% of the resources that were mobilized for the war effort was through private parties, through private decisions, companies, and so on and so forth. The World War II effort was in fact, exactly the opposite. It was the government. We were talking about a much larger effort, of course, but that effort required the decisions to be made, right? The scientific and investment decisions to be made, not through some willy-nilly marketplace process. It would have never happened. It had to be made willfully on the part of our government and the American people, backing those decisions up, right? So that's what occurred. Yes, Joe.
Can you say something about, I mean, we have to keep coming back to this, about the difference between credit and money, because I had a conversation with a guy on just this World War II thing, and about how the government was issuing bills of credit to make this stuff happen, and he just couldn't figure it out. And of course, Trump has to figure it out too, right? But, how or is that too far off field?
It's a little too far off in terms of what I need to cover this week. No, I don't want to dismiss it, because it's important at the moment. It's important, given the situation that we're in. Let me. This may not help. It may help, but underlying the decision process that was made in the case of the mobilization for World War II is the same decision process or thinking process that goes back to Hamilton and earlier. You're not talking about money. Money is, money in terms of, buying and selling and so forth. All of that occurs in the process of these contracts. In the case we're talking about in terms of World War II, in terms of contracts that provide bombers, contracts that provide tanks, contracts that provide gloves, sunglasses, aviator glasses, you name it. All of that, of course, involves contracts and sales, and paychecks have to be issued to the workforce and so on and so forth. But that's secondary. I think that the primary thing to understand in terms of the notion of credit is the underlying process is that you're creating an increased potential for wealth. To invert that, to put it in the framework of what we're discussing here, you're increasing the economy of labor. You're reducing the costs per capita of the output which that very person is producing and others around them. And as a result, what you're doing is you're growing the wealth of the economy, and therefore the money issued you know, into the future to finance exactly such investments will more than pay for itself over time. That's the fundamental process. Now, of course, there was rationing during World War II. People sacrificed. All of that occurred as well. Not to oversimplify, but nonetheless, maybe the example of the aluminum industry is, you know, a case in point. You know, aluminum, of course, doesn't exist in nature. It can't be found. As far as we know, it can't be found in the universe. I mean, it's nowhere. It doesn't exist. Man created it. I mean, the ore out of which it's made is there in the ground and so forth, but aluminum doesn't exist. The development of aluminum for the aircraft industry is an extremely capital-intensive process. It involves a tremendous amount of electricity. Involves a tremendous. Anyway, it's a very involved process. Yet we were turning out B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 a day, as President Trump just recently cited at Willow Run in Michigan the other day. That was part of the arsenal of democracy. This exemplifies this process of not only increasing physical output simply by working people harder or putting more people to work or something of that sort, kind of linear sort, but the ability to transform the economy through new technologies, new resources, new applications of resources, and so forth, that therefore makes the question of credit issuance a self-redeeming process, as against usurious lending processes. So I don't want to go further into Roosevelt, and you know, there was the order by the president to bring in all the gold supplies and prevent the sale of gold abroad and so forth, because we were at one point involved. Roosevelt early on was involved in financial warfare with Britain. British markets were attempting to break the dollar, to break Roosevelt. This was before Churchill and company decided, well, we need the U.S. to defeat Hitler. You know, then they changed the tune, but nonetheless, the steps had to be taken to defend the U.S. dollar and defend our trade relationships and so forth by similar kinds of actions. So the complex of measures taken is exactly that, more complex. But going on then, if that helps.
Yeah.
Going on, in 1984, what did Lynn identify as 3 critical areas, the 3 critical areas that would allow for the integration of investment in science with return on investment decisions in the productive process. He identified 1, and this is on page 71, organized plasmas of very high energy flux density. And this goes back to what we've been discussing in terms of energy flux density and increases of energy flux density as the means by which you show an improvement in technology. It defines technology. Technology is the means. Technology, the simplest explanation of technology is a Leibnizian one, the most direct. And we came across it earlier in So We Wish to Know All About Economics, which is if you have an operative and he has 2 machines, identical on the outside, but with one machine, that operative is more productive than the other, then there's something about the internal organization of that better machine that differentiates it from the other. And that's an improvement in technology. And the mastery of those concepts, beginning with heat-powered, steam-powered, heat-powered machinery, coal-driven and so forth, is where you see the beginnings of this these advanced concept of physical economy, which LaRouche was picking up again and developing in the 1950s and 60s. So in this case, we're talking about organized plasmas of very high energy flux density. Secondly, high energy flux density coherent radiation as a tool of production and other applications. 3, new directions of fundamental breakthrough in biology, including as an auxiliary feature, not as the fundamental feature, progress in microbiology. Those were the 3 areas that he highlighted, and those are still the 3 critical areas. If you look at LaRouche's 4th law, in terms of the 4 laws, these are very much the heart of what's required today.
They were also the heart of the SDI.
And they were the heart of the SDI program as LaRouche advanced it with President Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s. Now, just to give you a couple of examples on this in terms of, I mean, obviously plasmas, here we're talking about is what's typified in fusion research. The question of creating and maintaining materials in a plasma state, that is superheating a gas to the point that it becomes ionized, stripped of electrons, and you're talking about 10, 20, 30, 40 million degrees inside these test fusion reactors, up to 100 million degrees. Hotter than the sun, hotter than we know of in nature, that we find in nature, except perhaps in the stars, but that's speculative. Plasmas are already being utilized today. I mean, again, this was written in, this is 33 years ago that the book was published, but still we're only on the verge of tapping plasma technology. He's talking about very high energy flux densities. Low energy flux density plasmas are already utilized to treat metal surfaces, to transform their adhesive characteristics. They're involved to treat and create thermal barriers on engine parts, aircraft engine parts. But as we've emphasized again in the new document, America's Future on the New Silk Road, the real potential in terms of plasmas and fusion energy is in the solar system, is in interplanetary flight, is in the applications of these extremely energy flux dense processes to move us around the solar system, but also to use it in mining, fusion torch processes, and besides what we may know about in terms of the potential for fusion torch processes to recycle anything, to take Earth and sort it out by its constituent elements, by ionizing dirt into its elements of minerals and so forth, and therefore creating virtually unlimited resources. But if you're talking about going out into the solar system, the amount of power that each individual will have to utilize to act efficiently to transform the environment for man, those levels are going to have to be extraordinary compared to what we have on hand today for mining, for earth forming, otherwise, other systems. So I just wanted to indicate, obviously lasers are used today in terms of energy, high energy flux density coherent radiation. Lasers are the most direct example of that, and people know, I mean, kids, wayward adults go out and point a laser at an aircraft flying overhead, blinding temporarily pilots. I mean, so suddenly you suddenly have a very, your kind of eyes go wide and you say, oh my God, this is an incredible capability. It's like magic or something. But additive manufacturing, I mean, your aircraft parts are now being produced through additive manufacturing. Rather than casting, welding, a metal powder, alloy powder, is simply laid down a millimeter or less thick, and lasers are used to consolidate that into a solid surface, and then layer upon layer is built up, like you were building up a cake, right? Or what's the Greek dessert?
Baklava.
Baklava, right? Layer after layer. with the lasers welding together, so to speak, this powder. So, and then of course you do it using 3D, you're using quote unquote 3D printing, but the point is that you're using lasers directed, utilizing advanced computer capabilities to build up a specific item, complex part, right, in every detail. And when it's done, it's a single piece of metal, and maybe even a special alloy metal that couldn't have been made through welding and so forth. You couldn't have put those pieces together in some other fashion. This is additive manufacturing. So when people think of 3D printing, and if you're on your way to Mars, and you need a new liver or something, they can just print it out. Or I mean, there's people think about making little plastic toys with getting a 3D printer and making toys or something. The real, obviously a very important, if not the most important aspect of this, is the application to this in precision manufacturing, in terms of being able to create not just the same product, but a better product, a product with higher tolerances, higher heat resistance, so on and so forth. You weld something, a weld can always break, right? Under certain conditions and so forth. Additive manufacturing means an incredible new capability. So this is I'm using this as simply an example of the kind of thing that has come into play. And then in terms of biological breakthroughs, I think that this is still, LaRouche makes the point, and we discussed the golden mean here or there a little bit, golden section, going back to Leonardo da Vinci. The question is that we've known, as was discovered by da Vinci and his collaborators, that living processes are fundamentally different than non-living. And the question of life and the nature of life is going to be essential to the development of healthcare, the increasing of longevity, the fighting of plant disease, and so on and so forth. The biogenic migration of atoms. That's a big phrase, but some of you have some familiarity with it. Well, think of a dinosaur. A dinosaur dies, and we discover it, at least we think we discover it today, in the form of oil. So what was in a living form, has those atoms, molecules, whatever, have migrated, so to speak, through the form of tar sands and so forth into a fuel supply, driving the economy. All right. The migration of nitrogen through the biosphere, the processing of nitrogen. This is something we're scraping the surface of in terms of understanding the transformations that occur as molecules, atoms, and so forth are put through living processes and transformed. And what is going on in those living processes? And what does that have to do with life? And what is life?
Transformation of photosynthesis.
Yes, photosynthesis, yes. Did you want to say something?
I was just saying that's another example.
Another example.
Erica actually talks about that in his, you have the development, as you were talking about, how does life actually reproduce itself? How does it transform?
Non-living into living processes.
Right.
Yeah. Very good point. Very good. So he emphasizes that these are the fundamental areas for a fundamental breakthrough that are required to make a shift today, and we've begun a little bit on that process in the last 33 years, but only beginning because, in fact, of course, this approach to economic decision-making and scientific decision-making has not taken hold. The effort has been made. The SDI initiative was mentioned earlier. We have a new potential now for reviving the U.S. space program, another example in terms of how to drive this process forward in terms of these frontiers. But he goes on to say, this is at the bottom of 71, these areas of fundamental breakthrough all require a shift in research and applications to Riemannian physics and to the standpoint of the ontological transfinite. We require a society which thinks and manages the development of its economy in those same terms of reference. All right. Let me, can we go to, let's go forward on the slides a little bit. Our Nautilus shell. Let's see, can you go forward a few more? Let's see, where are we? Well, there, that's a useful place here to speak in terms of this, of what we can just briefly identify here again for people in terms of a transfinite process. And when LaRouche says ontological transfinite, he's counterposing that to, you could say, a methodological transfinite. There's lots of people that work with complex numbers, lots of engineers, all well-meaning people used, and so forth and so on. However, the approach is that of a good mechanic or a good doctor. A good doctor can't tell you what life is, but you hope he can keep you patched together, right? I had a doctor friend of mine, Dr. John Grauerholz, who told me that that's the secret of why doctors try to be kept on a pedestal. It's because they're terrified that they're going to be discovered to be simple mechanics, because they actually don't understand what they're doing in the fundamental sense of knowing what life is, which is it's not to cast dispersion on doctors, but it's to recognize we've got a long ways to go in terms of our understanding. But Lynn, as opposed to simply utilizing the tools of the transfinite, he's emphasizing the truthfulness of the transfinite, the existence, the fundamental underlying existence of the transfinite is what has to be grasped as the basis for going forward in science. That is, we're not interested in what we see empirically. We're interested in understanding what is causing, what is creating, unseen to us, the processes that we come across as singularities in, for example, the visual domain. So, for example, if we take this slide up here, willful human entropy. I was speaking to this at the beginning. Here you have, over the course of time, shown here as a series of cones of ever increasing flaring, I guess, for lack of a better word, from left to right, from wood burning, and I confirm this today. Over half the wood burned in the world, even according to the environmental groups, they bet that over half the wood utilized in the world today is for simple burning. It's burned for fuel. You know, if you want to reduce, if you want to stop deforestation, get people electricity, build power plants in Africa. I mean, give the world, what they need. Let's move them up the ladder quickly, right? Let's leapfrog them up the ladder. But here we have moving from wood through coal to petroleum. Obviously, each of these increasing energy density. As Jason has commented, you wouldn't try to run a modern railroad by burning wood. You couldn't power a city by burning wood. You can think of similar examples: uranium, deuterium. What is the transfinite linking these various transformations? These transformations are discoveries of principle by man, of the world around him, applying those discoveries to transform existence for mankind, for society. We can recognize creativity as the red dye running through this process as a transfinite. What is the nature of man? It's a good, useful way, a simple way to again approach this. If you say, "Oh, the ontological transfinite," what is that? It's something in mathematics. It's something in mathematical physics. But what is it? Well, think about it. Who are you as a human being? Are you simply the summing up of your cells and so many quarts of blood and so on and so forth? Or are you simply a mass of feeling states, here today, gone tomorrow, you know, as Lynn was talking about baby boomers, or maybe you're just depressed all the time, or maybe, you know, or maybe you're on opioids, or what? Is that what defines you as a human being? Or are you what define you as a human being in terms of what you yourself would characterize as your soul? Is that something transfinite, right? Something beyond that, the biological, for example. So what is mankind as a whole? What are we here for? What are we part of in terms of a process of transformation of the universe? What I wanted to do, go back to where we were before, because we're going to come back to, yeah, just, well, the Nautilus show, that's fine. We'll just start there. Now, what we have to do is we have to look at the labor force. How are we doing on time here? Okay, let's try to wrap this up relatively quickly here. Oh, okay, I got you. I'm being told I've got to stick around to answer some questions.
Yes.
Okay. Let me regroup. Okay. Now, okay, so we talked about some of these features. I'm not talking about just simply today, but over the last couple of weeks, few weeks. We have to talk about the social division of labor. We have to talk about the organization of society. Technology, energy flux density, increasing population, you know, or increasing relative potential population, or potential relative population density, and so forth. What are the characteristics of the division of labor that are required? How do we look at that? And just to put a term on it, Lynn references the term briefly, national income accounting. Now, why am I saying it? Besides trying to bore you and put you to sleep. National income accounting. All right. I mean, this goes back to the 1930s at least. I mean, you can imagine for a war mobilization effort and so forth to try to determine the bill of materials of everything that has to go into everything across the country. It was an enormous undertaking. So a lot of national income accounting developed in that period. But national income accounting today is just, I mean, it's a lot of baloney, and it's internationalized, and there's international standards, and oh my God, you can imagine how bad that probably is. But you know, in essence, this is where gross domestic product comes from, gross national product. All of these terms you hear are features of national income accounting. You got to know what you're producing, what the value of it is, you know, to make projections in the future, whether you're trying to make income tax revenue projections or whatever. You have to have some kind of snapshot of where you are as an economy and whether you're developing or not developing. Now, again, LaRouche is posing here the basis for reestablishing the approach to national income accounting on a physical economic basis, as taking it out of the range of the gross, as LaRouche used to say, the very gross national product and the gross, very gross domestic product and so forth, concepts. Because these concepts today measure simply in terms of basically a kind of value-added approach in which overhead as a category, and we'll come back to that in a second, is jumbled up together with productive activity and simply added on, so that somebody working a casino or ripping, a predator on Wall Street, a bankster on Wall Street, the money they're making is part of what's growing the gross domestic product of the United States when it's absolute thievery, as you know. So obviously, if we're going to, if President Trump, if the U.S. Congress is going to, and they're going to have to, take in hand what is now a completely bankrupt financial and economic system, they're going to have to establish on a whole new basis the basis for making decisions. and judging the success or failure of decisions already made, right, going forward. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about here ideas and kind of, airy-fairy. We're talking about these as real ideas that we're going to be challenged to apply. Whether we're directly involved ourselves in that decision-making process or as informed citizens, we have to be, judging this for ourselves and aiding that process as citizens. When we look at the workforce, or look at the population? I mean, remember, we were talking about increasing potential relative population density.
Do you want the lights, or should we? I'm going to go back to slides.
No, don't worry.
Well, you can turn on the lights for a few minutes here. Thank you. I want to lose this track on me. If you're well, what's the key word in potential relative population density? Population.
Right.
We got to we're talking about the population. Okay. All right. Now, what produces the population? I'm not talking about the birds and bees, but what produces the population?
Living standards.
Households. Well, yes.
Yeah.
Living standards. Yes, and that's where we're going, right? We're taught we have to look at households. This is a matter of the census. Why do we take a census? I mean, so again, these are not abstract things that Lynn's kind of putting down in a textbook someplace for some.
So they can spy on you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. Keisha said they do census just so they can spy on you. Yeah. No, there actually should be a useful purpose, not what GCHQ is or NSA or whatever is trying to. I'm sorry?
The iPhone?
Oh, that's what the iPhones are for. They don't need the census to do that. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And your watch.
So we're looking at households. So the basic starting point breakdown in terms of looking at households is you're looking at the households from the standpoint of the age of the people in the household. Start there. So Lynn uses the term modal age range of the workforce. Obviously, you have kids. They're growing up. They're different ages. You can break that down, in terms of categories: babies, infants, grade schoolers, and so on and so forth. On the other end, you have people that are beyond the modal age range in terms of the workforce, including a number of people in this room. And you can also, you can break that down by categories as well. But in between, you can speak of the modal age range of the workforce for a given society. Right? And then, speaking in terms of that modal age range, Lynn goes and develops this in more detail in the book, but I'm just wanted to highlight a few features. He says what we want to focus in on is we want to focus in on the operatives. There are the operatives, the workforce operatives in the workforce, right? And they come out of these households. It's not every member of the household. It's not the real young. It's not the real old. But it's not also every adult in the household, right? Because there's parents that are raising kids, and that can shift. And he says it doesn't matter. We're looking at this in terms of a broad overview. If one person drops out of the workforce, another person enters the workforce, and so forth. That's less important than the overall picture of the process you're talking about here. Now that those operatives have to produce, by definition, have to produce 100% of what those households, that entire the households of that population of the operative portion of the population has to be produced by that workforce. All right, 100% to keep it going. If it's not producing that, you're in trouble. Right? Mm-hmm. It also has to produce the total output in its total output of the workforce. When we're speaking here of physical changes on nature for man, it also has to produce the overhead. It has to maintain the overhead of that society. Doctors, you know,
Teachers.
warriors, Indian chiefs, you know, I mean, all of that has to be maintained by the actual workforce making the physical changes on nature for men. You know, those are overhead expenses, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So if you turn here quickly to page 75, I think more or less gets us there. He says, we're now going to look at the workforce. We're going to take this workforce and we're going to break that output of those operatives, of the entire workforce, 100% of the workforce. And for the moment of here, Lynn emphasizes this again and again. We're looking at the economy as if it was one single agro-industrial firm, right, as opposed to thousands of companies and so forth, for simplification to develop the concepts here from the top down, right? Okay, so in terms of the output of this single unitary agro-industrial firm, you have at the bottom of 74, you have, first of all, V, which traditionally stands for variable capital, but we'll leave that aside. The portion of total physical goods output required by the households of 100% of the operative segment. This is, he points out, part of the energy of the system. To simply maintain the energy of the system, that is the reproduction of society, right? That has got to be, has to be provided in terms of the output. C, capital of goods consumed by production of physical goods. What does he mean? Well, if you're producing something, you're wearing something out. There's friction, right? There's that entropic process in the small, right? So that wear and tear of equipment, that's got to be accounted for. It has to be depreciated into the accounting practices and so forth. But more importantly, it has to be replaced over time. That equipment is going to have to be replaced. Okay? So there has to be, in the ongoing production of the society as a whole, of this integrated agro-industrial firm, there has to be the continued production of C, quantity of C, sufficient to offset the wear and tear loss that's going into the productive process. Plant machinery, he mentions maintenance of basic economic infrastructure, right? Also, what Congress never wants to talk about, never gets around to budgeting, always debates, always but never, right? You know, we get older and city budgets don't include, you know, we got 100-year-old, you know, pipes and so forth in the city because, you know, because we're not maintaining these things, right? But this, in the real world, this is what you have to maintain, right? This also is part of the energy of the system. Then you have S. You have, on the next page, 75, S for surplus. Gross operating profit of this consolidated agro-industrial enterprise. So that T, the total output of the physical goods, is minus C, that is minus what you have to put it back into it just to keep it going. V, what you got to do to keep your not only your operatives alive, but their families alive and in good health, right? So they'll be around for the next cycle, for the next generation of the workforce, right? So it's the total output minus C and minus V, or as it put here, minus C plus V. And then that gives you what? What's left over is a surplus. Ah, what's wrong? We can't leave it there, can we? We mentioned something a little bit a moment ago, which is the overhead. What's going to pay for the overhead? Well, that overhead has got to come out of that surplus, right? And Lynn's very specific on this. LaRouche is very specific on this. It's not T minus C plus V plus D, right, that gives you S. D is something that you've got to look at very critically, the overhead. This is where, you know, you've got to cut the front office. You got to minimize the front office. What pays the bills is what's coming out of the back of the office, what's coming off the factory floor, to use the old, you know, an old metaphor, right? That's where the investment's got to be made. The front office, the sales force, etc., may be necessary, right? Yeah, I mean, you have to have people to go out and let people know you've got a product, you know, included, say, an additive manufacturing product, which, you know, they've never seen before. So, you know, these other activities may be necessary, but they're to be minimized in the productive process. Now, if once you subtract out D, then you have what he identifies as S prime, the net operating profit of the physical goods output. Again, we're not talking about dollars and cents here. We're talking about the physical output. You know, can come in different forms, right? You know, extra bolts, extra machine tools, you know, extra tires, cars, you know, whatever, it can come in all, but we're talking about in physical terms, it's a surplus of output beyond what's necessary to simply maintain the existing process of simple reproduction. That is what then can be plowed back into the economy to grow it, right? Like that Nautilus shell. To grow it in the sense of an expanding a cone, spiral and a cone, as we've discussed in past weeks. So let's go to the slide here and look at this, because we got to take it to one further level of refinement here. And I'm sorry this is so dark, but this is we're looking at ratios now in terms of growing the economy and identifying certain features that we can look at. Again, this is in terms of decision-making processes. Okay, productivity. How do we look at productivity? That's the first one. The symbol is S. I'll repeat it just in case it's not clear. S over S plus V.
It's prime?
Yes. Yes. Productivity. This should be S over C plus V. Yeah, it should be C. S over C plus V. Excuse that mistake in this first line. It's S over C plus V.
It's also on page 76.
Yeah, that's right. Top of 76. S over C plus V is productivity. That is, how much surplus are you generating relative to your costs, your existing costs of production, maintaining your equipotential, your energy of your system. Okay. The second one down, expense ratio. Well, that's the overhead expense. Maybe fully could be put overhead expense ratio. Right, D, in this case for overhead, to the ratio of C plus V. All right. The third one down, stop me if something's not clear. C to V is the capital intensity. And this is extremely important. Obviously, you have your cost of your labor force. The ratio of C, that is capital, to V is a measure of the capital intensity of your economy. If you have a impoverished developing country whose population is not only largely agrarian, but largely an agrarian workforce that's working essentially with muscle labor and little more, and maybe some irrigation, primitive irrigation, and so on and so forth, the capital intensity is very low. If you bring in modern irrigation, you bring in fertilizers, you bring in those as elements of inputs, your costs of C to maintain the system, once you begin doing that, goes up, right? C is going up relative to V. V may be going up as well, the standard of living per capita of the households and so forth, as you improve the output. But C is going up relative to V. And we'll come back to all of these again. And then finally, S prime over C, and again, there's a mistake there. S prime over C plus V is the rate of profit. S prime over C plus V is a rate of profit. Again, I'm not talking in dollars terms, but in terms of the free energy created by your economy for reinvestment back into the economy. Right? Now, for that Nautilus shell to grow, for this economy to grow continuously, to overcome finite resources, marginalized resources, and so forth, to make the next round of technological breakthroughs, what has to happen to productivity? Yes, over C plus V? What has to be happening? Going up.
That's from.
S prime over S, well, just S,
Yeah.
first of all, yeah. And S prime over C plus V has to be going up. Right? Because you got to be putting more back in. That's going to draw down your resource base, so you're going to have to create even more free energy to continue the process, right?
That means that your living standard has to be going up, your rate of life expectancy has to be going up, because if you're gonna have a rate of productivity and increase in profit, you're gonna have the people and the minds to produce the new sets of productivity which is needed, because, if you take the example of today, where in the United States, as compared to what we just heard about in Russia, where in the United States you have an increase in the death rates of both younger people and older people, then what's your rate of productivity in terms of household market basket, household value? Because you're not going to have the younger people to go to work, so you're killing off the younger people because they're being killed as they're being born, because the rate of birth deaths going on, and then the rate of deaths going on with older people is, synonymous at the same time. So it's also the question of the increase in longevity, life expectancy, and the people needed to increase this productivity and the rate of profit.
Right.
So again, going back to your potential relative population density and the increase of that, what is the future going to look like?
Right.
From that.
And just to put a fine point on it, if you're investing more and more, I think this is obvious or clear just as I stated, as if you're investing more and more into your people, into your citizenry, it behooves you to ensure that their lifespan is expended to increase their productive lifespan, and so that the payback, the greatest, if you will, in crude terms, payback from that investment of society is there at an increasing rate. Yes. So capital intensity has to be increasing, the rate of profit has to be increasing, the rate of productivity has to be expensing, and the expense ratio. Now there's a real tricky business. Go on to the next one. I think you have to go for, yeah, well, that's fine, yes, that one. Here we have categories of overhead expenses. Yeah. Now think about it, overhead expenses. Can you read it? Maybe it's just okay. Yeah, sure. Overhead expense. These are categories of overhead expense. First, on the left-hand side, services includes science. Engineering is a subset of science. Teaching, medical, production, administrative, that is supervisory, production management. Again, these people are not directly productive, but obviously to some degree required, right? Then the second column over, vertical column is labeled institutional. That's government, non-economic. That includes services, administration, police, and military. Below that is non-governmental under the institutional category, including selling, financial, legal, other services, and then waste, just pure overhead expense. A portion, which is the third vertical column, is labeled waste. And the first under that is unemployment.
That's a big one.
That's a big waste, right? And we have a huge big waste now, not only through unemployment, but also underemployment and misemployment. And then the second under waste is undesirable, financial usury, ground rent, commodity speculation, crime, immoral, legal, non-functional luxury as categories.
That become the category of economics today.
Now, that last waste has become the economy today, right? It lulled the baby boomers to sleep. As long as they could go to the casino and get the drugs and whatever,
Lie on the beach.
lie on the beach, buy their CDs,
I'm sorry,
you know,
it's called non-functional
go to their
luxury.
Metallica conference and
Yeah.
concerts. or whatever.
Yeah, and the last one, non-functional luxury.
Non-functional luxury.
In other words, it does nothing to improve the productivity
Yeah,
of the individual. Right, as
Or
opposed to
society, yeah.
going to the gym or, you know, what's big.
Yes, it's lost. It's lost to society. It's not merely that these people are being wasteful, that or expenditures in this area is wasteful. It's that the human beings, the creative potential of the people of these people that are suffered to one degree or another from these these kinds of behavior and expenditures is lost, and everyone suffers as a consequence, not only present but past and future. So now, but what happens as we develop, as society develops? That is, if we're improving the, reducing the mortality rate, we're increasing the educational standards in terms of the number of years in school, real school. That's a whole other subject. You can use other examples. Increasing medical care. Well, what's going to happen to example in terms of the first column, in terms of economic overhead expenses? Aren't teaching expenses and medical expenses and so forth going to go up? Yeah. So over time, certain categories of expenditure in terms of overhead expenses, are going to go up, need to go up, are required to go up. Others, of course, you're going to have to reduce. In fact, it's actually, you know, incumbent upon you to reduce them as rapidly as possible from the outset, as the need for a war on drugs today. So overhead expenses is something, again, that's not something automatic. Right? It's not like something you plug it into a computer and it tells you what you know, what's overhead and therefore can be done without. It's something that has to be thought out, but from the standpoint of realizing that it is an overhead expense. LaRouche makes the point in his economics book that, you know, forget social sciences. I mean, just throw them out the window, you know, just as a category. Sociology, psychology, anthropology, throw it out the window, you know. You can let some of it back in slowly, you know, perhaps. So overhead expenses. The last part of the chapter on economic value in particular, chapter 4, and I borrow from chapter 8 and so forth here as well, but is on negentropy. And that's, I just want to come back to that briefly. What is all of this about? Go back to that last one that we showed there, if you could, Linda. Thank you. These categories. What is all this for? Increase in these categories of productivity, capital intensity, rate of profit is to increase the negentropy of the system. The growth, the development, increasing rates of S prime over C plus V, and increasing rates of increases of S prime over C plus V. That is the intention, to overcome marginal resources to continue mankind's progress. And specifically, if we're talking about our single agro-industrial economy, to ensure its continued prosperity and development. And Lynn emphasizes, again, this is in 1984, he's emphasizing, he quotes Shelley right off the bat on page 79, or references him, that the actual, in developing the point, that what the critical component here is in the transmission of ideas, the development of the negentropy through the labor operatives, through the transmission of ideas in Plato's sense of species. Not ideas understood as description or explanation, but, and this is page 80, ideas as controllers of the actions of persons, practical actions to change nature to mankind's advantage. We have assigned the systemic discussion of scientific ideas' internal characteristics to the following section of the text. At this stage of the present section, we are borrowing credit from that future part of the text to identify as much of the matter as is indispensable for stating what follows immediately here. It is the creation, assimilation, transmission, and realization of those scientific and related discoveries whose practice represents potential economy of labor, which is the negentropic feature of the social process of production of physical goods. I would just add to this, what is the effect, or he uses it as an example, so I'll just use it here. If we reduce the cost, if we increase the productivity of the economy by 5% in a given cycle, call it a year, you can call it 5 years, let's call it a year, 5% increase in productivity. 5% increased productivity means that what was produced in the last cycle can now be produced with 95% of the wherewithal that the operatives expended to produce that before. Now what's available as free energy to the system is the S prime plus 5%. Right? There's your neg entropy. There's your essential transformation, and it's through the economy of labor. So, I'll conclude there, and we're open for questions, discussion. Those that may have gone to sleep, you can wake up. I hope that wasn't too boring. Because this is some of this material in this area. When you start talking about national income accounting, you know you're in trouble. Go ahead, question.
Well, I was just looking, because I hadn't read this before.
Sure,
I was
sure.
reading it alongside my partner here. And, one thing that I kept noticing was the elimination of the human element called greed. You're talking about total cooperation, like a colony, like a bee colony or something. Right now, look what's going on with all of the hacking, you know, and that's spoiling any kind of coordination that to do this. It's going in there and undoing things.
Well,
That's security.
this is a battle with the oligarchy, and it's a good point to bring up. I mean, I'm answering it maybe in a different way than you mean it in asking it, but I think I'm really going, hopefully, to the heart of the matter. Look, I mean, the attempt is to change the narrative here. The election was a revolt against the destruction of the American workforce, the destruction wreaked by globalization. You know, it was a massive revolt. It wasn't, and it's not only here, but as we've emphasized, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized and Helga has emphasized, this has been global. This is an ongoing revolutionary process that's going on. Now, the attempt is to say, oh, what happened? Well, it's because the Russians fixed the election. The Russians hacked this. The Russians hacked the DNC. Hillary didn't lose the election. She was an angel sent from on high. It was the Russian hackers that screwed it all up, you know, and so on and so forth. As opposed to facing the reality that something much more fundamental is going on, something that is transfinite, you know, that's not empirical, but that's going on at a more fundamental level. Hacking is not such a big problem. If you take GCHQ, NSA, and so forth out of the picture, I mean, Mr. Snowden did a good job, and then we got new Snowdens apparently coming to the fore with the WikiLeaks materials that have just come forward. But anyway, the point is, what they're pointing out is that the hacking, quote unquote hacking, is coming from within our own agencies.
From the CIA.
From the CIA, et cetera, right? So NSA and the rest, GCHQ, so forth. So all right. So what does that mean? Well, yes, we have elements in society, right? Just as Alexander Hamilton faced them in the form of Aaron Burr, among others, that do not want the advancement of mankind. Okay, and they've expended a great deal of effort to try to convince us all that we should give up on our humanity and simply be greedy. That's not just a problem in this country. I mean, in dealing with any country, a so-called developing country or lack of developing country, you know, people are pushed down they've been pushed down by generations of colonialism, among other things. And so people look out for themselves and their immediate family. And so somebody gets into office, and the tendency among many people that get into office is to try to steal everything in sight for their family, because the rest of it to them is superficial. It's not real. It's all just about survival of the fittest, right? And so, but that's not man. That's what man gets reduced to, right? And the beauty of the moment is we have the opportunity for man now to step forward as man again, or grow up and become men and women, as opposed to adolescence, as Helga likes to say, to at least enter the beginnings of adulthood. So yes, we are at a very important turning point. We've been at a similar turning point in the past. The American Revolution was one such turning point. And we wouldn't be here today if that wasn't in part successful. And it was in part successful because of what our founding fathers, including Alexander Hamilton, did to initiate certain processes that embedded into our law and into our way of thinking more fundamentally, you know, the general welfare clause, which we keep coming back to, you know, we as a nation. And so that's what we have to build on. So, you know, there's not a simple answer, but, you know, the enemy is within, so to speak. The enemy, you know, is not somebody out there somewhere else. We can clean up our own, you know, we can clean our own house. We can clean up our own house. Maybe that helps. Yeah.
So to understand those various letters correctly, the variable capital, as you said, the V, speaks only to those operatives whose family or family members are actually directly involved in production.
Right.
And so everything, and then the capital is the capital intensity. So that ratio, capital intensity over that workforce that's producing everything, everything outside of that is part of the D, the overhead. So since we're functioning right now with a society at about 15% or less in production, the actual, if you're looking at one entire agro-industrial complex, we have about 15% of the workforce actually involved in the categories we have to be involved in.
Yeah. I mean, as you know, we've been documenting that, you know, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was 34%. We were down to 30, if I recall, 35% of the workforce was then. And now we're down.
Right, so if you look at the whole environmentalist, the global all this is vectored in the opposite direction. We got to change it.
However, the advantage we have today is exactly the new Silk Road.
Right.
Exactly, that while we have destroyed our productive capabilities, at least temporarily, other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, particularly with the role of China, as you know, have developed very rapidly exactly those capabilities that we threw away. And that's a godsend for us. And that's why it's interesting that Trump the other day, speaking at Willow Run up there in Michigan, at the very, at least from what I have, it's towards the tail end of his speech, he said he was praising American workers in terms of you know, their potential, their productivity and future productivity. And then he said, this is a paraphrase, he called on people to also, quote, respect and place your faith in companies from foreign lands that come here to build their product. We love them too, right?
Wow.
You know, I mean, you know, Japan is prepared, China is prepared to make enormous investments back into the United States, right, as part of their conspiracy to bring the U.S. into the new Silk Road, back to to ourselves, so to speak. So I think that's a good way of kind of, you know, bringing that into the picture, you know.
So definitely the transportation infrastructure, that would be part of the the B, or is that part of the C?
Part of C.
That's part of the C.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Maintaining it.
Mhm.
Just maintaining. Now, the development of new infrastructure would be utilization of S prime. Right? It would be taking free energy and putting it in. In the case of China and Japan coming in, they're going to utilize some of their free energy, right, for the sake of building up our capabilities for the long-term betterment of their own position in the world, right? I mean, the improvement of mankind as a whole.
So, I don't know if this has ever been done, but has there actually been anything done as a study to compare the rate of investment in the economy in infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, especially high-speed rail, right, versus China?
Well, I'm sure there are. I mean, there's been horrible studies. You know, I'm thinking of one, you know, that was done by Oxford or at Oxford University. But even the Economist of London, a couple months back, then came out with a pair of articles which pointed to this Oxford study and said, well, the outcome that we're seeing now in China disproves it. The Oxford study said that China's enormous investments in high-speed rail, in particular, is what the study focused on, was going to create essentially it was going to choke off economic development in China. That there's no way that there could be a payback from these systems that would be rational from the standpoint of the expenditures made. And lo and behold, the London Economist article said, on railroad after rail, high-speed rail after high-speed rail, not all of them yet, but on the major ones, they're already returning a quote-unquote profit. And the way in which that's occurring is because the actual amount of travel on these high-speed rail, approximately 50%, I think the figure was actually 45% if I remember right, but something like 45 to 50% of the traffic on these high-speed rail systems was of people who had never utilized these routes before, these routes from point A to point B. In other words, new economic activity, new exchange of ideas, and so on was occurring, which never would have occurred before.
These are passengers.
Passengers, but also the movement of ideas and the movement of freight too. But I think it's really important to emphasize the movement of ideas. That you're multiplying your productivity of your population by making accessible travel on a route which moves people, you know, in a matter of minutes compared to hours or days or travel that wouldn't even have occurred at all. And so, and that shouldn't be really a surprise to us if we think back to the Transcontinental Railroad, but also to the development of America's railroad systems. I mean, rapidly and over the period of decades, even before the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, we were multiplying the productivity of the country through the development of an integrated railroad system spreading out of from the East Coast inward. And of course, that was integrated with barge traffic and, you know, other modes of transportation and so forth. It was continually improving. You know, so if you say you could say the economic throughput of the system was increasing, right? The speed of turnover in the economy would be another way you could think about it, was increasing and multiplying. So China is seeing a payback, and that's really secondary. I mean, the fault I would have with what the London Economist wrote was, not that it's some deep article or something, but is simply that even if China didn't have a quote unquote profit on those rail lines for 20 years, fine, because the payoff to the economy as a whole from being able to move physical goods and services and people and so forth was going to be having a multiplying effect, whether it was measured at the turnstile in terms of gate receipts, so to speak, at the turnstile, if you follow what I'm saying. But even in the narrow terms of the economist, the Rothschild, City of London economist, lo and behold, what China's doing makes sense.
But hasn't it also led to creating new cities?
I'm sorry?
Hasn't it also led to creating new cities in China?
Well, that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
Yep. That's another, just like the Transcontinental Railroad led to the development of new cities. Is that?
Yeah.
That's your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's all kinds of multiplying effects like that. And the article deals with that. That you now have people moving out to the ends of these new rail lines and setting up shop with the idea that a new city is going to grow up around that railroad stop. They may wait 10 years, 20 years, but they're they see that as as where to be.
I think part of the transition in the way of looking at economy is reflected also in this Chinese decision to because they're not doing anything with those bonds that they're holding. They want to actually invest that in the U.S. economy, which it's just revolutionary.
Right, it is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
They see this mess in the U.S. Economy, that they've noted, and the Nomi Prince interview, which is now on the LaRouche PAC website. I mean, she developed some of that the Chinese have been increasingly critical and comprehending as to the crisis emerging in the United States economy. So here you have it. They're turning around, instead of these U.S. government bonds, they're saying, well, look, we want to put this in the infrastructure, your infrastructure. It's real jujitsu.
It sort of reminds me back of the way that Hamilton dealt with the debt of the state.
Absolutely, it's a Hamiltonian action. Yeah. National credit action.
How is the response to that? How is the response to that? China saying we want to invest in infrastructure in the U.S. I know they're already doing it elsewhere.
Well, I think that's what I think this is what this quote from. I'm not trying to put all the weight on this one quote.
Okay,
but
when Trump said that. Okay.
Yeah, that's what he's
a very simplistic way.
Yeah. He's indicating it. He's speaking to a bunch of auto workers, or former auto workers in the Midwest, and saying we're going to rebuild the arsenal of democracy. He specifies that, right? That's his terminology, citing the World War II effort. But then he says, but we also like those people that come from abroad and invest and build here, right? We like them too, right? I mean, so yeah, I think, we know it in more ways than one. I mean, there's people in his advisory circles and so forth that have advisory positions in China. They're Americans, but they know China. They've invested there. They're partners with companies there, and some of those circles are including Wilbur Ross. Know in very real terms aspects of the economic miracle in China, and of course Trump has written about it in his own book about visiting China and what he saw there and so forth. So again, it's up to us. It's not up to Trump. It's up to us. And LaRouche's book, So You Wish to Know All About Economics, and the new report, which will soon be available PDF. It's now available digitally on the LaRouche PAC website. LaRouche's 4 Laws, America's Future on the New Silk Road. That's on the LaRouche PAC website. It's close to the top of the homepage. Just scroll down a little bit. This is the reading material and study material, and these are the concepts that we need to bring forward and need to be brought forward if we're actually going to see this process through successfully. That you're speaking to. I mean, otherwise it's a mere potentiality.
Tillerson's there now, isn't he?
Yes, Tillerson.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And Trump is supposed to meet with Xi next couple weeks. Well,
April 6th, 7th, around that time.
Mm-hmm.
But just to be clear on the transfinite.
Okay.
The transfinite is above the transgender.
Above the transgender, yes. Good point. Transfinite is above the transgender. All right, that's Joel DeJean's sage contribution to the discussion. Yes.
Okay.
All right, so you ended here? We'll end the broadcast for today.